Well, hey Zoe.
Hi.
Out of everyone we've talked to today, you and I definitely know each other the least.
Yes.
So I would love if you want to take a moment and introduce yourself and talk a little bit about your background in the wide world of well-being.
Absolutely. I was introduced to mindfulness and spirituality from a very young age. I was raised Buddhist. I grew up in like a real bubble, right? Like I thought that was very normal. I grew up in the Blue Mountains of Australia, so out in kind of the middle of nowhere, in this space that was very like soft and safe. And then I like ventured out and moved to New York and really like wanted to.
Straight from there?
Yeah.
Wow.
I wanted the opposite. But yeah, I have so many tools that I think I don't realize that I have because of how I was brought up. And I'm so grateful to both be raised in Australia, but also just to be raised by two people who are both American and then moved there to try to kind of build a new life that was really around like, I don't want to say like anti-capitalism, but like something that called like a deeper meaning.
It didn't revolve around a conversation about work or accumulating wealth the same way every conversation starts and ends.
Yes.
Here.
Yes. Which was huge for me. I mean, funnily enough, I now ended up in corporate America, but I started off wanting to be an artist, and I was really like fostered to be given that space. It was something that both my parents did. They were both creatives in the beginning. My dad was an actor and my mom went to Juilliard for piano. So they were really creative and then kind of continued to be creative, but just in a different realm. So yeah, I'm still honestly like grappling with how my upbringing was different. Like I still think about it all the time, and I it's still normal to me, right? Like I think I carry so much of that with myself every day, and then I tell people, and they're like, "Oh, that's really interesting. That's really unusual." And I'm like, "Is it?" Like,
yeah.
To me, it's so normal.
Shared language, it experience becomes language,
right?
And then you walk around realizing that you're speaking an entirely different language than everybody, because your background is so different, and it's got to be really trippy. There's, you're coming from somewhere that's culturally so different, but speaks the same language in terms of the literal sense.
Yeah.
And so you have this totally different bank of experiences. And what was it like to jump straight into New York? I mean, just go 0 to 100 in that way.
Yeah. I did a lot of disassociating, I think. I mean, a part of it was like wanting to really push away everything that I had growing up and just be like a completely new person. Because I felt weird, and I felt like the tools that I had been given were like not useful to me, and I wanted to like start with new ones and wanted to be an artist, and I wanted to struggle, and I wanted to like experience new people and different things. And it's been, since I left like 13 years ago, maybe, it's been like a complete full circle of me kind of returning to all the things that I left behind. But New York was really, I think most people experience it as just like crusty, stinky, overwhelming, like really something that makes you grow up.
Yeah.
For sure.
Forces you to.
Yeah.
Whether you want to or not. And that's what's so interesting about that contrast. Moving to New York to be an artist is kind of it's a path a lot of people have taken, but not from where you're from.
Right.
What was it, an act of wanting a new experience, or was it rebellion? Was it this thing of, I've been raised around this thing that now you have this appreciation of, but at the time you're like, I gotta get the fuck out?
Oh yeah, it was definitely the latter. I wanted it to be difficult. I think a lot of artists think that like you kind of have to suffer for your art.
Yeah.
And coming from a place that was like very safe and very comfortable, like Australia is mostly middle class. It's very like, we have all the infrastructure to like make a happy country and happy people. I wanted something that was different and something that would help me grow and really kind of like, it was really an act of rebellion. But in that, I really found myself. I lost myself for a while, but
I think you got to do one to do the other.
Yeah.
And so now you've come back to a lot of those values. Obviously, do you remember what some of those core values were specifically of Buddhism, of the way you were raised, that you said, this is what I need to escape from?
I think because they were so intertwined and ingrained in my life and my identity that I didn't even know that they were Buddhist. Like my mom read, like all of my children's books growing up were all spiritual and Buddhist fables. Like it it's so interwoven in the fabric of who I am that I don't think I specifically like rejected a value. I think I've always carried them with me, but I've lately been reflecting on them more. I think as I get older and as I do more of my own internal work, like out in the world, thinking about compassion and like really thinking about interconnectedness and how we're so clutched to our identities, right? Like we so badly want to be this thing. We want to be a creative director. We want to be an artist.
A title, a label.
Yeah. And we cling to it and it shapes us and it takes us further away from like this inner, what in Buddhism we call like the inner gold or like Buddha nature that is like, we all have this nature in us. We don't actually have to do anything at all to be good. It's there.
You know, in the current way that you have to make money being an artist, the people who actually don't make art for a living have more separation of work and non-work. You know, you can go do a, you know, if it's a consulting job or whatever, you can go do that and then you can leave that.
Right.
You know, what we're talking about is saying like for your internal creative pursuits, you have to do an external creative pursuit within that structure. And you've spent so much time working in the creative world around wellness. I'd love to hear a bit about how you kind of started there and how you identified that these two things can come together.
Yeah. Well, let me start with giving some context. So I'm a creative director. I work in corporate America. I've been doing that for about 12 years. And as I've started to kind of come back and have this homecoming that I mentioned around my own spirituality and wellness as a whole, I've been reaching for just to immerse myself in the culture, right? And so I finished my yoga teacher training last year. I started teaching yoga and mindfulness meditation, breath work. And with that, I started to kind of have more work popping up for me that was a little bit more aligned with that. I never really thought about like creating my own personal brand. It kind of like made me feel yucky.
Right. As it does for many of us.
Yeah, it still does a little bit, but they've started to kind of cross over in a really beautiful way. But I'm realizing that they're only crossing over at face value. Like at the core, existing as somebody who really cares about people's well-being and spirituality in corporate America doesn't work. Like
there's an inherent
they can't.
block there.
They can't. Like corporate America wants to make money. And when I think about people and their well-being and wellness and spirituality, like we really just have to value what makes people feel whole and what makes them feel seen, heard, and understood. And that is something that I don't know if they'll ever coexist.
You know, I something that really stuck with me as it applies to the wellness world is nobody makes money. You take money.
Right.
So it's this idea that inherently for people to get well, you have to take something from them.
Right.
Which is in complete opposition with what you're talking about.
Yeah.
With this internal value, this intrinsic value that everybody brings just by being.
Yes.
Just by arriving. And I think, you know, we do a lot of similar work. And it's always really interesting for us because I think you always fall back on the crux of education and saying, oh, like it's doing this amazing thing, bringing these resources to people. But then you really think like, what would actually allow for more of this kind of collective distribution of these resources?
Yeah.
And based on, you know, your upbringing and growing up so far outside of outside of America, what if you, on average, meeting someone on the street, what is the single value or the single piece of information that you wish I could just pass this kind of instantly?
I think interconnectedness is really important, right? That like, and it goes back to what I was talking about, that this like internal inner gold is like, we're all really connected and everything that we do has an impact on the other person, right? Like if you cut somebody off in traffic, like understanding that like there is an ecosystem that we're a part of. And I think in like the current state of being living in a big city, that's really hard to understand that like what you're doing might impact somebody else, but it's incredibly important. And I think it's something that people can't really grasp, right? Because I'm different than you. So like I'm more important than you. I'm rushing to go to this thing. I have to be here. You have to get out of my way. Understanding that like everybody has their own struggles. Everybody's going through something. And if you can kind of create that space and be compassionate and understanding and have like an open awareness to how you're moving through the world, I think, the world would be a better place. And I don't say that to, spiritually bypass or sort of like wash over the struggles that people experience. But I think it is a really important thing to think about, like just how we're all connected.
Yeah.
And that, you already have everything you need. Can I read something?
Of course. Absolutely.
Pema Chodron is one of my favorite Buddhist authors, and I read this page almost every day. We already have everything we need. There is no need for self-improvement. All these trips that we lay on ourselves, the heavy-duty fearing that we're bad and hoping that we're good, the identities that we are so dearly clinging to, the rage, the jealousy, and the addictions of all kinds never touch our basic wealth. They are clouds that temporarily block the sun. But all the time, our warmth and brilliance are right there. This is who we really are. We are one blink of an eye away from being fully awake. Looking at ourselves this way is very different from our usual habit. From the perspective that you don't need to change, you can feel as wretched as you like, and you're still a good candidate for enlightenment. You can feel like the world's most hopeless basket case, but that feeling is your wealth, not something to be thrown out or improved upon. It's a beautiful thing. It's a beautiful thing to not feel like you have to like buy the thing or do the thing or be different or be better to be happy, right?
You don't arrive.
Right. You're already here. I think it's a revolutionary thing to like, to also try to pass along to people, right? That you don't have to have the title, you don't have to get the job, you don't have to buy the thing to be worthy. You already have it. And it's a very counterintuitive thing in late stage capitalism. And I feel that rub constantly, right?
Well, and it's so important to bring that up.
Yeah.
Because, you a few minutes ago added a disclaimer. You said, yes, there are very real things that people navigate and not trying to, wash that away with spirituality. But the truth is that the bare minimum kind of social infrastructure removes the need for that disclaimer.
Right.
Because if people had the ability to just be
right.
without losing a home,
right.
It really does change the dynamic.
Yes.
What is inherently so interesting about these intersections of creativity and wellness is that people refuse to acknowledge that without labeling it as good or bad. We have to do it. We understand that is not going to change overnight. Right. There is not going to be some deep upheaval of it. It is not happening. Right. So acknowledging the thing, yes, it's shitty the way we have to go about it, but understanding that we still have to go about it is
right.
really interesting.
Right.
And I think that's what's so different here because of the lack of kind of those basic social
yes.
structures that we talked about. And so based on what you've seen in the world of, wellness and mindfulness in Australia versus here, how does the lack of those basic social structures kind of impact the way that we go about it here?
I think the monetary exchange is a big one here. Like everything costs money. Everything's very expensive. And
in LA especially.
In LA especially, but especially now there's this kind of new trend, and I say this with all due respect, of sort of like smaller companies popping up that offer classes that are very curated, that are like double the price of a normal yoga class. We're talking like $40, $50 to do something that you could go to a local studio and it could be by donation, right? Yeah. And I think they are beneficial, certain ones, but I think that there's like a rebrand of wellness that's happening that is just like charging. And it's,
is there?
It's, it's really scary. And it's scary to also think about, for myself, moving into this space, trying to build my own studio, and how do I do what I want to do from a creative standpoint, right? Make it look a certain way, build a brand around it, what I do every day. But how do I also make sure that it's accessible for people?
Well, it's so interesting because, we're talking about it in the context of well-being. We're very different because we're a nonprofit.
Right.
So there is this component, we made the conscious decision, which we're privileged to be able to make early on, of like, we're not going to like ask people on Instagram, fundraise, do right. that. But, if you look at what it takes right now to start a studio, let's start one thing, you have to go out and raise money.
Right.
And what that means is convincing people with an excess of resources that they will be able to make money on people who hope to get well.
Right.
And that's
it's
really
scary.
Sinister.
Yeah.
Like that's really sinister to think about. And that's not, once again, I really appreciate this conversation because we're not shitting on anybody.
No,
you got to do what you got to do.
Yes.
And like, look, it's better to go start a wellness studio than some awful company that is going to, like strip away at the fabric of certain communities.
Yes.
But at the same time, like, it's worth acknowledging.
Yes.
Because as long as we're all on the same page, then you have the ability to move forward. We were talking before we sat down about your studio, and I asked you, how's it going? And you gave me such a comforting answer. You were like, it's great. I'm just kind of taking it slow, which is amazing, because people don't usually, when they're building something, say, I'm going to do it once and see how people like it. And then hopefully do it again with a few more people, and again with a few more people. And over the course of years, not months, develop a community, develop an audience, and eventually maybe I will be able to lean on the offerings that I bring to that community to be able to do it all the time.
Yes.
So I'd love if you want to take a second to reflect on kind of, what drew you to inner outer, and kind of the identity you're hoping to build behind this thing, not from a this is the structure of the business standpoint, but just the ideas that are really important to you to get across.
Absolutely. So to backtrack a little bit, for a very long time, I was an athlete growing up. So I was a gymnast for until I was about 14. I started really young.
You were busy until you were 14.
I was very busy. Yeah. I was Buddhist. I was doing backflips. It was a lot
of descriptors.
Yeah. And I'm short, and I was very athletic, and I grew up in the early 2000s. So I grew up with issues with my body and how I looked. And I then, as I've been like working in fashion and working in wellness and working in, movement and sport, as I've been healing, and now I consider myself recovered, I've been sort of like reflecting on how damaging the wellness industry and some wellness professionals can be around like women's images and women's health. And so inner outer sort of is a little bit broader than like a yoga studio, and it's really born around like bettering out inner selves to better out outer selves, right? And that can look like a lot of different things. That can look like practicing the physical elements of yoga, the asanas, what we would call like a vinyasa class, to feel more embodied and present within yourself. But that could also look like practicing meditation or showing up for your community, or some like Ayurvedic supplements, right? It's a lot more broad. And I think I was listening to a podcast the other day, and I can't remember who said it, but they were saying like, you have to build what you want, right? You have to build what you want that isn't there yet, that doesn't exist yet. And
otherwise you're just chasing.
Right. Or I'm doing what everybody else wants, and it's not going to be genuine. And that's what inner outer is. It's really something that is beyond the physical and beyond like the individual, right? It's building real, authentic community based on things that people care about and trying to better ourselves. And I think also you kind of touched on the idea of like building it slowly. And I think that's a really important part of the process, is like, I have an idea, I have a framework, but doing this slowly allows me to also kind of learn from people, learn from other people, and let them help me build it, which is such an important part of it, right?
I think anything meaningful is built slowly.
Yeah.
And when you try to approach something fast, you have to be so specific so quickly.
Yeah.
And then you kind of like put your feet in cement.
Yeah.
And that cement dries really fast, and then you can't really move.
Right.
So it's really cool, because this thing has to be untethered. Otherwise you're not going to be able to serve people, because you haven't learned how people need this information, these practices, these classes brought to them yet.
Right.
And so you have the opportunity now to spend time just learning and observing and understanding within your community, like, this is how I can help people.
Yeah.
And I think the speed is what's really, it's what we're trying to do here too with the Charlie Fund. We're not rushing to scale and to, help 1 million kids overnight. It's like, let's just do a couple things well, and then all come to the table really intentionally, just like, what worked, what didn't, what went well. And I think it's almost an inverse reaction to what Indigo and I do in the wellness space. We spend so much time working with people who have very quick goals and goals that they need to achieve really fast. And that's cool for your business, but it is not necessarily effective for collective well-being.
Right.
And I think that's what's so interesting about the conversation. And you're also coming at it as a founder, as a creative, as an artist,
right?
Which is so different. You're waiting for the information to come to you. I think to switch gears for a second to creativity.
Yeah, please.
One thing that I'm very interested to talk about because of your perspective is the idea of people who say that they aren't creative. Because, you know, we talk to people all the time and they say, like, oh, well, I'm not creative. So, and I think being in wellness gives you a really interesting lens on it, because, you know, people can be creative in the way that they move their bodies and be creative in problem solving in any form. So I would love, just if you want to for a second, to reflect on this idea of creativity in your own well-being and the type of creativity that everybody has, not just people who make art.
Yes. Well, having parents who are therapists, I would do myself a disservice if I did not mention my own therapist once. I had a really hard time kind of letting go of my identity as a creative director once I started moving into like teaching yoga. Like I was like, how do these two things coexist? Because they are so different. And I was really struggling to wrap my head around like, well, if I'm this, then I'm not that. And I think it happens a lot of the time too, where people can't really understand like being multifaceted, right? They're like, oh, well, you are this, I put you in a box, I can move on, I can understand you, and then we can keep going, right? So I was talking to her about it. Her name's Stephanie. Shout out Stephanie. We love her. And she told me like, Zoe, being a yoga teacher is one of the most creative things you can do, right? You're curating a space for people, how it smells, how it sounds. You are directing. Yes.
You are creatively directing people's bodies.
Yes. You're picking the music, you're doing all of these things, and even just sequencing a flow is incredibly creative. The way that my voice sounds, like everything about it. And I kind of like brushed it off. And then as I started teaching more, I was like, oh, she was so right. It is such a beautiful creative practice. And I think when people think about, not having that traditional output, right? Not being a painter, not doing this thing, I think inherently like every decision, every decision that we make is a creative decision. And I truly believe that. And I think it's also like very interlinked with spirituality, right? Like letting something flow really freely through you is such a creative act. Like just like letting.
Even just an idea.
Yes.
Let it come.
Yes.
Let it go. You don't have to do something with it. That's, you know, these ideas of labeling emotions.
Absolutely.
Feel a thing. Let the thing come. Let the thing go. And your interpretation of that feeling is your own creativity.
Yes. I think it was on a podcast or something, but I'm going to misquote it. So I'll kind of like butcher it. But this guy was saying that like, when we're worrying, we're like making up a story, right? Like when we're worrying about the future, we're making something up. So why wouldn't we like make up something great? Why wouldn't we just imagine like the best possible scenario? And, you know, humans have a negativity bias, like we know why, but I always think about that when I'm in like a state of worry or like grasping, like, oh, I can just make it up. Like I can make it be great.
No one knows anything.
Right.
There is absolutely no certainty.
Yes.
So like you might as well make it up.
Yes. And there's such freedom in that, right? Yeah. But yeah, I think everybody's creative, like really, truly. And having parents who were like traditionally creative and then moved into the wellness world, which I'm like now reflecting on, I'm like, oh, I'm doing the exact same thing. Right. Like I'm having the exact same journey. I still view them as very creative people, like really, truly.
Is there something that you've been working towards, you know, and it could be, I guess, chipping away as a means to an end, everything that you've done to get to like kind of that ultimate level of happiness for you? You know, what does that look like with the information that you have today?
Yeah. I was listening to, I don't know if you guys are familiar with Tara Brach. She's a very wonderful Buddhist psychotherapist. You should look her up. She's amazing. But she was talking today, she does these podcasts that are like Dharma talks, and she was talking about how like you never really reach happiness. It's with you at every moment. Yep. And that is like an incredibly hard concept to grasp when we are always looking for like a goal or a thing to do or a thing to reach. But I try to think about that all the time. Like, what can I appreciate in this moment and what can I be grateful for? I read this great book by Shauna Shapiro called Good Morning, I Love You. And I, like, by and large, the biggest takeaway from that book was like every morning she wakes up, when she puts her feet on the ground, she said, good morning, I love you. And I do it all the time. And it brings me so much joy with that present moment because it's all we have. And that sounds kind of cliche, but it's true. I, for a very long time, was very much like, I was very career driven. So I was like, I have to do this thing and I have to get this thing. And I want to be like the youngest, whatever. And as soon as I let that go, it was so freeing. Like, I was so much happier. But want to say it's taken like years to
Yeah.
even like skim the surface of like that concept.
The idea of the goal, you achieve the goal when you
Right.
stop labeling them, when you stop
Yes.
thinking about them, when you say like, I'm just going to be.
Right.
And once I think also by the time you achieve a goal you set, that goal is no longer your goal.
Right.
And that's the thing that I think is really interesting about like what you're talking about, and a lot of people we know who are in similar fields. You go through this whole exercise of being a creative, and you say like, I want to validate my creativity through this job or this role or this client, and then you don't stop to actually think like, okay, like did I get to the goal that I set
Right.
before? Because you probably did.
Right.
You probably like already, whatever goal you set, you probably like lapped it, and then you just got bored, so you set another one.
Right.
And then, you know, if you think that way, you eventually die with a goal you didn't reach.
Yes.
Instead of just accepting, you know, like whatever kind of comes with that.
Yeah, I stopped writing like yearly goals, and I just like set intentions, really. And I set intentions a lot when I'm going into like a big, like a photo shoot or like a big meeting. I'll set an intention to maybe be more present or be more understanding of somebody else's perspective. And I think it's a really beautiful shift to like have wishes for yourself and not goals, because there's a softness around that and like an understanding that like you can wish for something, and if it doesn't happen, it doesn't matter. Right.
I decided my New Year's resolutions this year were just all going to be dumb on
I
purpose.
love that.
So like, just like watch more movies. If you like don't get there, so be it.
Yes.
You know?
Yes.
So with inner outer and building that, rather than thinking about the goal as an end point, if you had to pick 3 words that you want your practices, your principles, your ideas that you pass on to people to embody, what would those 3 words be? Knowing that they will change inevitably.
Presence. It's a really big one for myself and for like any sort of future endeavor, and also for the creative practice, right? Like being present throughout it. I think a lot of the times as creatives, we like feel that burst and we like rush through it to try to like get it out. And like, what would it look like to sort of be present with the feeling and like create some distance, right? Yeah. I think openness is a really big one. Being open to everything. Pema Chodron often says like in the hardest moments, like what can this moment teach me? And I think about that all the time, like having an openness to like the difficult moments and an openness to the greatest moments, and not labeling them, but just allowing them to be there. And then connection, right? It's something that as a spiritual person and as an introvert, I don't connect with people enough. I spend a lot of time alone. I love my own company. And so with building a business and building potentially a physical space or whatever it ends up being, I'm going to have to like connect with people in a really real way. And it's going to be hard. I love it, but it's a challenge for sure.
It's amazing to think about like where those 3 intersect.
Yeah.
And also all 3 of those ideas feed back into themselves.
Right.
Presence leads to connection.
Right.
You know, connection leads to openness, and the cycle just continues.
Yeah.
You know, those things spiral, and you're creating a spiral of where you can just wake up every day and say, if I'm embodying those 3 values, then I did it.
Yeah. Yeah. Living in alignment with my values is a big thing that I learned over the last couple of years as I've been like sort of taking stock of like the decisions that I've made. I feel like I just like woke up one day and was like, oh, I'm like sentient. Like how did I arrive here?
You woke up.
Yeah, I woke up. Sometimes I'm like, I really wish I didn't, because this is incredibly painful, but
reconciling things that you know can never be reconciled is hard.
Yes. But yeah, it's such a trip, and I'm just so grateful like that I was raised the way that I was, and that I've just like had the values bestowed on me that I still continue to live by, and can just like, try to move through this world in like a kind and compassionate way.
I don't think there's a better place to wrap up than gratitude. I think we're there. I think we did it.
Thank you.
Woo! Thank you so much.